Plan for insertion. As the Dauntless came out of warp on the edge of the Epsilon SETI system, the long-range sensors screamed a warning. 8 Norran knife fighters were already in orbit around the colony, and the sensors had picked up a new warp rift forming in the outer system. More enemies were pouring out to support their brethren aerospace wings. Briggs barked into the ship-wide communications. Neutralize those new arrivals before they can connect with a Keith watched on the monitors as the Dauntless's fighter wing sped out of the hangar base. The wedge-shaped Scimitar aerospace superiority craft looked like birds of prey as they clawed for altitude. He was sure they'd get the job done. Now he just had to do the same thing. Keith's strike team quietly boarded the M-Black assault shuttle. As it slipped out of the Dauntless hangar bay, the small craft's cloaking field came to life. In the cockpit, Corporal Jenahar. The nimble ship is dodging and weaving to avoid stray plasma blasts, and D-sensors are picking up the hostages. LT Jenna said that her voice was calm and professional, even though the situation was very bad. It sounds like the Norran have them captured in the central plaza. I count 12 tangos on guard duty. Keith nodded while looking at the tactical feed on his HUD. Roger, please take us in quietly and drop us off on the rooftop with a view of the plaza. We'll hide and move in for the night. The muffled engines were barely audible as it flared its landing thrusters at the last second and touched down on a rooftop with cat-like grace. Keith and his Marines quickly disembarked, their active camouflage coming into play as they crept to the edge of the roof below them. The hostages were huddled in fear, and the Narran guards were pacing back and forth, their reptilian eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. Keith told his team to spread out and take positions to sentries whirled around his plasma rifle and aimed directly at Private Mike Sorensen's position. The alien fired a scorching blue bolt of energy that hit Mike's armor, the advanced composite plating absorbing most of the impact but still doing damage. Their cover was blown, and contact open fire was made. Keith barked into the comms, and his own rifle snapped up to aim at the nearest enemy. The plaza erupted in a hail of gas rounds and plasma fire as the 2 Marines' better weapons and armor gave them the upper hand, and one by one, the Norran guards were killed by the intense fire, but not before killing a few helpless hostages in a cruel act of revenge. As the last shots were fired, Keith and his team rushed to protect the remaining colonists, checking them for injuries and radioing for an immediate medical evacuation. Suddenly, a huge explosion ripped through a nearby building, sending shockwaves through the building. As a final message to their human enemies, the Narcans set off one of their plasma bombs. Keith Key's voice could be heard on his communications. "Grim Captain Briggs, this is Lieutenant Campbell. We've secured the hostages, but the Narcans set off one of their bombs. We have multiple casualties and need immediate extraction." Briggs' voice cracked over the net, tinged with static from the ongoing space battle. "Acknowledged, Lieutenant. Our fighters have neutralized the enemy ships that came through the I'm sending the Dauntless to help, but heavy enemy reinforcements are coming soon. Hold the line until we can get you out of there, Briggs." Keith looked at his strike team, and his face hardened behind his visor. They all knew what those incoming Norran reinforcements meant. A bloody, desperate battle to keep the remaining colonists alive long enough for extraction. But they were Marines, so that's what they did. Get these civilians to a safe place and get ready for the storm that's coming. Ura's Marines yelled back. They knew that many of them probably wouldn't make it out of this colony alive, but they were determined to make sure the Novi paid a heavy price for every inch of land and every human life. As the team led the shell-shocked colonists to a nearby bunker complex, the first Novi drop pods hit the colony. Tightening his grip on his rifle, Keith's boots stomped on the permacrete as he and his Marines rushed the last few colonists to the waiting assault shuttle. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air as a new wave of Norran soldiers stormed into the colony, having just been beamed down from their ships in orbit. The aliens let out guttural war cries and charged at the humans, covering fire Keith bark dropping to the ground. He raised his shoulder and fired a burst of hypersonic slugs at the advancing Nosen. Next to him, Mike and the other Marines opened fire, their weapons cutting deadly patterns through the enemy's ranks. Several Morans dropped their armor because of the Marines' relentless fire, but more kept coming, hurling the bodies of their dead friends. Keith cursed under his breath as he ejected a spent magazine and slammed a new one home, saying they just needed to buy a little more. The bridge shook as a plasma torpedo hit its forward shields. Captain Briggs grabbed the arms of her command chair as the deck shook under her. "Shields at 30%, yelled the tactical officer over the noise of battle. "We can't take much more of this." Briggs clenched her teeth as she watched the Norran knife fighters swarm around her ship like a pack of hyenas. The Dauntless's particle beam cannons repeatedly speared the enemy. 2 more seemed to appear and take its place. "Concentrate fire on their lay-in ships," Briggs ordered, "and get our fighter wings back here to cover us on the planet below." Keith felt a sense of relief as the last of the colonists climbed aboard the assault shuttle. The ship's engines roared to life, sending up a cloud of dust and debris as it took off from the plaza. But just as it started to climb, a plasma grenade shot through the air. Voices over the comm said, "Get those civilians out of here." Keith yelled over the radio, "We'll cover you." As the damaged shuttle limped away, Keith and his Marines hid behind the broken pieces of a stone fountain. Norran soldiers poured into the plaza with plasma rifles firing. Keith popped out from behind cover and fired at a charging alien, sending AO spraying out of his broken skull. "Mike," yelled someone else. As the Marines started their fighting withdrawal, an explosion happened in the middle of a group of Norskins, scattering their smoking bodies across the plaza. But more kept coming, an endless tide of snarling reptilian killers. Keith knew they were running out of time. He typed his comms, his voice rough from being tired and high on adrenaline. "All units, this is Lieutenant Campbell. Fall back to secondary defensive positions. We'll make our stand in the colony's central bunker complex." Wilma took a desperate turn when a plasma torpedo hit the Dauntless, weakening its shields and slamming into its warp drive. The ship shook violently, with consoles exploding in sparks across the bridge. "Warp drive is offline," the helmsman reported, his voice tense with fear. "We're dead in the water," Briggs said, pounding her fist on her armrest. She knew this was it. The Norran would destroy her damaged ship, but she wasn't going to let them have it. She yelled into the fleet communications engineering, "Cover us." She also said, "I need that warp drive back from yesterday, and someone get me firing solutions on every Spirits, Dan Norran ship out there." As the crew rushed to do what she said, the Dauntless's guns hammered defiance at the circling Nosen. Briggs couldn't help but think of Keith and his Marines down on the planet. She knew they'd fight to the death, just like her crew, but against these odds, the sensor officer console lit up. As the bridge view screen came on, Briggs shook in her chair and stared at the weathered, scared visage of Admiral Tran, the legendary commander of the U.S. Invincible. "These Norran bastards need some help," Captain TR said with a gruff rumble. "Let's show them what happens when you piss off the human race," Briggs said. Huge human battleships and cruisers poured out of the warp rift, their guns already blazing as they tore into the Norran's open flank. The enemy ships were shocked by the sudden onslaught, and their formation broke as they tried to reorient themselves to face this new threat. Briggs felt a fierce grin spread across her face as she leaned forward in her chair and stared hard at Keith. "All ships weapons free. Let's finish this," he said. He jerked to the side, and the blade just missed his throat by an inch. The Norran growled, its reptilian eyes burning with rage as it slashed again. Keith blocked the blow with his armored forearm, and the knife's edge skittered across the cracked composite plating. He then slammed his other fist into the Norran's gut, feeling the alien's scales crack under the force of the blow. The Norran grunted but didn't go down, instead headbutting Keith with great force. Stars went off. Upon impact, his helmet's visor spiderwebbed, and the Norran pressed its advantage, its knife darting in over and over again to find weak spots in Keith's armor. Keith backed up, his boots scrambling for grip on the loose gravel, and he could feel blood running down his face from a cut above his eye. He could taste copper in his mouth, and his armor systems kept screaming warnings at him. Power levels critical, structural integrity compromised, life support. The battle had changed when the Invincible and its fleet arrived. The Norran ships were suddenly met with a wall of humans, and their guns broke and ran. Their hulls were covered in glowing craters from the Dauntless's vengeful fire. But as they ran, the aliens fired one last barrage of plasma torpedoes at the Dauntless. The ship's point defense grid lit up with bright lances of energy that pierced the incoming warheads, causing explosions and damage to the void. The Dauntless's armor shrugged off the plasma bullets. Miss Quark smashed through the defensive fire and slammed into the Dauntless's port side like an angry god's fist. The armor plating broke, letting out a spray of crystals as the ship lurched under the impact on the bridge, where Captain Briggs clung to her chair as the deck shook beneath her feet. Damage alarms went off, and the cries of the wounded filled the smoke-filled air. Briggs barked her eyes and said, "Fier." Briggs' heart sank because she knew what those emergency bulkheads meant. They were an impenetrable wall between the crew and safety, a cold equation that sacrificed the few to save the many, every captain's worst nightmare on the planet. Keith could barely hear the chatter over the comms. All he could hear was the snarling Norran in front of him. The alien was weakening, and green blood was oozing from a dozen wounds, but it refused to fall. Keith grabbed the Norran by the wrist, and the two of them fought over who would control the blade. The alien was strong, with muscles that looked like steel cables under its scales. Keith's armor groaned and whined as he matched his increased strength against the Norran's raw fury. Suddenly, the ground next to them erupted in a fiery explosion, and Keith's eyes went wide as he saw a flight of Raptor attack helicopters screaming over the battlefield with their rocket pods and gorse. The aliens scattered, and their formation broke apart under the attack. Keith jumped at his chance and yelled, "This is Lieutenant Campbell. I need an emergency beam out now." But as he spoke, he saw a flash of movement, a hurt Norran, its armor smoking, and Rose emerging from the rubble with a plasma launcher in its hands, aiming at the hovering Raptors with its finger on the trigger. Without thinking, Keith let go of the ensign he was holding. He hit it just as it fired the plasma grenade, which arced harmlessly into the air and went off in a blinding flash. The explosion threw Keith and the Norran backwards, sending them tumbling over the cliff's edge. As they fell, the aliens' claws scrabbled at Keith's armor as they hit the rough rocks below. Keith felt the bone-jarring impact as they hit the ground, his armor cracking like an eggshell. Through blurry eyes, he saw then. It lunged at him with its eyes burning with primal hate and the blade flashing down. Keith clenched his teeth as he caught the Nor's knife hand in his armored grip. The impact was so hard that Keith almost lost his grip on the knife. The Nor hissed, and its happy breath washed over Keith's visor as it lunged forward to try to hold him down with its sheer mass. They rolled across the rocky ground in a tangle of strained limbs, and he could see red damage alerts flashing in his peripheral vision and could feel the Norran's claws scrabbling at his chest plate, trying to grab and rip. With a roar of effort, Keith heaved himself up, forcing the Nor back. He pinned its knife hand to the ground and closed the other gauntlet around its throat. The alien thrashed beneath him, its eyes bulging with anger and hate. Keith snarled through clenched teeth. Its over the Norran spat a glob of thick saliva splat. Keith tightened his grip on the gauntlet's servos, which were buzzing with deadly power. It would have been so easy to crush the Norran and end this right then and there, but as he looked down at its torn and leaking scales and hate-filled eyes, he knew he couldn't. With a grunt, he raised his fist and brought it down on the alien's jaw with calculated force. The Norran went limp, its head lolling back and panting key. He put his thumb on the belt and saw a green light blinking in the gloom. He had to stay alive long enough for it to matter. High above the empty space, lit by the fires of dying ships, the Invincible and its mighty battle group tore into the Norran fleet, their ghost cannons and particle lances ripping through knife fighter hulls like they were made of paper. The aliens were stunned by the attack, their formation breaking like glass on the bridge of his broken flag. His lips were moving, and alarms were going off all around him. He could see the human ships closing in on the console, their hulls full of weapons ready to kill. "This is not over," he hissed, his eyes glowing with rage. "We will have our revenge. The humans will pay for this insult in blood." He pressed a red button on his armrest, and a klaxon started to sound. A deep voice said, the self-destruct sequence began. The bridge crew ran away as he smiled cruelly. The humans thought they had won, but they were wrong. This was just the beginning. He watched the human ships get bigger on the screen, lit up by the light of his dying fleet. As they got closer, Janus's flagship exploded, creating a miniature sun in the void. The blast wave hit the closest human ships, sending them flying away with their hulls scorched and shields broken. Captain Briggs jerked as the explosion's light hit the viewports. The ship's computer was cool and calm as it rattled off a long list of problems. Hull breaches on decks 9 through 13. Fires reported in engineering. Med Bay is overflowing with casualties. The warp drive is still down. Briggs focused his mind on the fading fury of Janus's funeral. The Narani was dead, but at what cost? How many more had he taken with him in his last act of vengeance? Captain Briggs. "This is Lieutenant Campbell. I've been recovered by S-Team and am on my way to the Dauntless." DG's let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Keith was alive, he said, battered but alive. That was more than many people could say. "I understood, Lieutenant," he replied, his voice rough report to Medbay immediately upon arrival, and Keith, "Good work down there." There was a pause and a hitch of breath that might have been a laugh. Briggs leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. For a moment, they had won. The colony was safe, the civilians had been evacuated, and the Narran threat had been broken, but at what cost? He shook himself out of the feeling and straightened his shoulders. There would be time to mourn the dead and count the lives lost later. For now, there was still work to be done. Helm set a course for the nearest starbase. He told me in a steady voice, "Get me aligned to the INV." Norran had been pushed back, but they weren't broken. They would regroup, rebuild, and come back, and humanity had to be ready. But for now, they could breathe, heal, and look to the stars to know that once again they had held the line and shown that when the galaxy pushed, humanity pushed back, and heaven helped anything that stood in their way. Keith lay on the medical bed, and the soft beeping of the monitors filled the room. He looked up at the ceiling and mentally relived the battle. The screams of the colonists, the sizzle of plasma bolts, and the crunch of Norran bones under his armored fists. The doorbell rang, jolting him from his thoughts. "Come in," he rasped, still roar from shouting orders over the D of combat. Captain Brigg walked into the room, his face lined with exhaustion. "Lieutenant Campbell, it's good to see you awake," he said. Keith struggled to sit up, and wincing as his battle. Briggs nodded. "Thanks to you and your team, you did a hell of a job down there, Keith. I've put you in for a commendation." Keith shook his head. "I was just doing my duty, sir, we all were." Briggs pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. "I just came from a briefing with Starfleet intelligence. They've been interrogating the Nor prisoner you captured." Keith's eyes narrowed. "What did he say?" "That the attack on the colony was a test. The Norskins wanted to see how our New York Town-class ships would perform in a real fight. They deliberately targeted the colony to lure us in." Keith's fists clenched his palms, squeezing firmly. "They ate those civilians as bait, sacrificed their own soldiers just to bloody our noses." Briggs sighed. "It gets worse. The prisoner claims this was just the beginning, that the Nosen High Command is planning more attacks like this. They want to bleed us dry, force us to overextend ourselves, defending every frontier outpost and colony." Keith felt a cold knot form in his gut, so Epsilon Ceti, all those lives lost it was for nothing. No, Briggs said firmly, we showed. We won't be pushed around, they told the Norrin. We'll fight tooth and nail to protect our own. Janus and his fleet paid the price for their pride. Keith looked down at his hands and remembered the feel of the Norrin scale under his gauntlets and the hot spray of alien blood on his visor. How many more colonies will suffer before this is over? Briggs asked Keith. I don't know, but I do know that as long as we have soldiers like you. The Briggs left the room, and Keith fell back onto his bed, his mind racing. The Dauntless limped through space, the star base getting steadily bigger in the viewports. Repair drones swarmed over the ship's hull, sending sparks flying as they worked to fix the battle scars. The star base hung in the void like a sparkling jewel, its spinning habitation ring sparkling in the light of the system. Star shuttles flew back and forth offloading wounded. A cheer went up from the station's crew and from the rescued colonists waiting in the docking bay. Keith, slightly limping and with Mike's help, made his way down the boarding ramp to a hero's welcome. People rushed forward to shake his hand and clap him on the back, their faces glowing with thanks and admiration. But even as he basked in their praise, Keith couldn't shake the chill that had settled in his bones. The Norrin were still out there planning to kill him. His dark thoughts were cut off by a shout from the crowd, "The Invincible is breaking orbit." Keith turned around to see the mighty battleship pulling away from the station, its engines flaring blue. There was a murmur of confusion and fear in the crowd's voices as they asked, "What's going on?" Mike asked with a furrowed brow. Keith's mind was focused as the realization hit him that the Norrin had hit another target. Keith couldn't do anything but watch helplessly as the Invincible disappeared into space and sped towards another battlefield. The Dauntless, whose wounds were still fresh, could only wait and heal. At that moment, Keith felt so tired that no amount of rest could get rid of his anger at how pointless everything seemed. They had won the battle, but the war seemed to go on and on with violence and suffering. Recoil that had shut up in his arms as he killed Norrin after Norrin. Was it his fate to fight, bleed, and watch his friends die all for a peace that seemed forever out of reach? He didn't know the answer, but he was sure that the fight would go on for the sake of the colonists and all of humanity, no matter what the cost or the scars it left on his soul. He was a Marine, and he would do his duty even if it killed him. The med bay doors. 3 staff engineers walked up to him, their faces showing a mix of worry and excitement. The lead engineer, a tall, wiry man with a shock of graying hair, put out his hand and said, "Lieutenant Campbell, I'm Dr. Sensen, Chief of Weapons Research. We need to talk." Keith sat up straighter, ignoring the pain in his ribs that was starting to heal. "What's this about?" asked Sensen. He looked at his coworkers and then spoke. "We've been studying the captured Norrin tech, specifically their plasma rifles." Putting a command on his data pad brought up a holographic schematic above Keith's bed. It was a Norrin plasma rifle, but there was something different about it. The plasma coils were bigger and more intricately wound. "This is a new type of weapon, Lieutenant. It fires a plasma bolt with an oscillating frequency that lets it go right through our armor, shielding even the Wolverines." Keith felt a chill go down his spine as he thought about how painful the plasma had been. If these had been on Epsilon, every Marine in that colony would have been killed, Sensen said grimly. "We got lucky this time, but we might not be so lucky next time." Keith clenched his fists. "So what's the plan? How do we stop these things?" The engineer asked with a fierce grin. "We're working on a countermeasure, a way to modulate our armor shields to block that oscillating frequency. But we need your help." Keith swung his legs off the bed and stood up. "What do you think?" Sensen asked him. Working with Sorensen's team, Keith spent a lot of time in the research labs. They ran a lot of simulations testing different shield modulations against the captured Norrin weapons. Keith's combat experience was very helpful in helping the engineers understand how the weapons might be used in a real battle. It was hard work with long hours and many setbacks, But Keith pushed himself harder than he ever had before, because he knew what was at stake every time he closed his eyes. CTI, he heard his Marines screaming as plasma bolts tore through their armor like paper. Never again, he swore to himself. While Keith and the engineers worked hard to perfect the defense, the war raged on. Reports came in of new attacks across the frontier, each one stronger and more vicious than the last. The Invincible and its fleet were working hard to answer every distress call and plea for help, but it was never enough. It seemed like the aliens had moved on to targeting civilian ships, like freighters, passenger liners, and cargo ships. Thousands of innocent people died in space as their ships were destroyed by plasma torpedoes and knife fighter guns. In the halls of Starfleet Command, grim-faced admirals looked over star charts and fleet dispositions. They all knew the truth. This wasn't a border conflict or a skirmish between patrol fleets. It was a war for survival, and the Norrin would not back down. The decision was made. The Norrin had to be stopped for good, and Starfleet would have to take the fight to the enemy's home world. The fleet began to gather, and the Dauntless, its scars healed and its armor shining, took its place at the center of the formation. In its hangar bay, Keith stood in front of his Marines with a fierce look in his eyes and a voice that could barely hold its anger. "This is it, Marines," he yelled. "Someone is out to kill us all. They've hurt us and bled us, and they think they can break us." He looked over the warriors and said, "They're wrong because they don't know what we're capable of. They don't know the lengths we go to protect our own, and they sure as hell don't know the fury they've unleashed." Keith's hand rested on the stock of his Gore rifle, the barrel of the gun shining in the hangar's lights at his hip. Emitter modulated with the countermeasure he helped create as a reminder of the price they paid and the debt they would collect. "We're the tip of the spear. We're the ones who will take the fight to the Norrin's own soil, and we will make them pay for every life they've taken and every drop of human blood they've spilled." There was a roar of approval from the soldiers, and Keith nodded. His heart was beating fast with excitement. As the Marines dispersed to their assault craft, Keith took a moment to look out into the shimmering energy field of the hangar bay and at the stars beyond. Out there, the Norrin homeworld waited, its defenses full of weapons of war. It would be a fight like no other he had ever seen, one that would push him and his Marines to their limits. But they would not give up. They could not, because this was war. As Keith stepped into his own assault pod, he felt a heavy sense of purpose settle over him like a shroud. No matter what, he would see this through for the sake of the dead, the innocent, and the future of humanity itself. The pod door shut with a hiss, and Keith felt the familiar kick of the launch thrusters. He closed his eyes and imagined the Norrin homeworld getting bigger in his mind. It was time to finish this task. As the human fleet came into the Norsen home system, Starfield lit up with angry red flashes of plasma fire, but there was no time to enjoy the view. A huge swarm of Norrin ships rushed to meet them, making a wall of knife-shaped hulls and spinal-mounted cannons on the bridge of the Dauntless. Captain Briggs leaned forward in his chair and stared hard. "All ships engage at will. Concentrate fire on their heaviest ships. Watch out for those plasma lances," he said. The Norrin charge hit the Dauntless's drop bay head-on, sending shields flaring and hulls buckling under the attack. Keith could feel the deck shiver under his armored boots as the ship took a glancing hit all around him. His Marines checked their weapons one last time, grim faces hidden behind their visors. After 30 seconds, the drop bay controller called out, "Stand by to deploy." Keith chimed, "Come on, Captain. We're ready to go." "Keep them off your back as long as we can," he said in a tight voice. The drop bay doors yawned open, letting the blue curve of the Nara homeworld fill the gap. Keith could see the flashes of orbital defense platforms and swarming fighter craft. This was going to be a hot landing. Go, go, go. Keith yelled as the drop pods slammed down their launch rails, the brutal acceleration throwing him back into his crash couch. Plasma bolts flew past the pod's tiny viewports as the Nora. The atmosphere was filled with stories of superheated plasma, and Keith clenched his teeth as the G-forces rose, threatening to knock him out in just a little longer. With bone-jarring force, the pods slammed into the ground, kicking up a cloud of dirt and broken rock. Keith was already out of his harness and moving before the hatch fully opened, firing his Gore rifle at the NATO soldiers who were swarming to meet them. Marines poured out of their pods. As the Norrin opened fire with crew-served weapons and fixed emplacements, Keith yelled, "Move, move, get to cover," and ran for a low ridgeline. His Marines followed, firing over each other as they jumped and hunkered down to fire at the advancing Norrin. The air cracked with the ozone, the snap of plasma, and the electricity of GS rounds. "Look," Sir Corporal Jenna Hartley called out, and Keith followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. Its underside was adorned with the largest plasma cannon Keith had ever seen, its barrel glowing an angry red as it slowly moved to aim at the battleships above. Keith pressed the keys on his long-range communicator, trying hard to keep his voice steady. "Captain Briggs, are you seeing this? The Norrin have some kind of superweapon in orbit," Briggs asked. There was a burst of static, and then Briggs' voice filled Keith's helmet. "We see it, Lieutenant," he said. Keith forced a hard swallow. His mind was racing. A frontal attack would be suicide, even with the new plasma defenses. They had to get inside that station and take it apart from the inside, and they needed a way to do that. His eyes fell on a damaged Norrin shuttle, smoking rising from the vents in its hull as it slid towards the landing zone to the east. A desperate plan began to form in Keith's mind. "Captain, I have an idea," he said. There was a moment of silence on the comm, and then Briggs spoke with a voice heavy with understanding. "You'll have it, Lieutenant. Just make it count," Briggs said. Keith then turned to his squad leaders, the people he trusted the most, Hartley, Sens, and Oury. "You're with me. We're going to take that shuttle and get on that station. The rest of you dig in and give them hell. Buy us as much time as you can." There were no protests or hesitations. Keith nodded with pride and fear in his chest. "Let's move out, Marines," he said. "Godspeed to us all." Keith stood at the edge of the rubble-strewn plaza with his rifle held loosely at his side. Around him, his Marines were setting up a perimeter to protect key buildings and rounding up the last few enemy soldiers who hadn't given up yet. But even as they did their jobs professionally, Keith could feel the unease that hung over them like a pall. There were blackened craters from orbital bombardment and the broken remains of once proud buildings. The streets were full of debris and the twisted remains of vehicles, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and death. Keith had seen this scene many times during the long months of the war, but now that the fighting was over and the occupation was starting, he saw the real cost of their victory everywhere. People were huddling in makeshift shelters, and children with haunted eyes looked through the rubble for food scraps or anything else of value. The bodies of the dead lay everywhere, left to rot in the sun. Keith felt a sudden surge of anger and frustration. What was the point of it all? What had they really accomplished here? Beyond more death and destruction, he thought of the brave Marines who had fought and died under his command. Keith had thought about these things before in the quiet moments between battles. Was there another way? Could they have found a way to peace that didn't involve so much bloodshed? These were questions he had thought about before, but now that he was facing the grim reality of the occupation, they weighed on him more than ever. Sergeant Oury arrived, her armor still stained with the blood of Norrin insurgents. "Professionalism, sir. We've secured the central district and set up checkpoints on all the main roads, but there's something you need to see." Keith frowned and motioned for her to lead the way. As they walked through the rubble-filled streets, they passed groups of wary civilians from Normandy and grim-faced Marines on patrol. Eventually, they reached a makeshift hospital that had been set up in the shell of a bombed-out building. The smell of blood and decay was overwhelming. They were covered in blood as they fought to save their people's lives, but it was the patients themselves that caught Keith's attention. They weren't soldiers, they were civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. Their injuries were terrible, caused by shrapnel, blast waves, and buildings falling down. Keith felt his stomach tighten as he saw how much pain was being shown. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice choked with emotion. "These people are combatants." "Yes, sir, but this is the reality of occupation. We can't just pack up and leave now that the fighting is over. We have a duty to help these people rebuild and find a way forward." Keith sighed and ran his hand over his face. He knew she was right, but that didn't make it any easier to take. He turned to leave, his mind already racing with the problems that lay ahead. As they walked back out into the damaged streets, Keith stopped to take a moment to look around. He knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous, but he also knew he couldn't turn his back on the Norran people after everything they had been through. He straightened his shoulders and said to Ari, "Come on, we have work to do." That was the end of the story. If you liked it and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. For every comment that says, "Thanks for your time," the Norran captain's blood ran cold as the human warship came out of warp. Its sleek, predatory hull was packed full of gun turrets and missile tubes. This wasn't just a patrol frigate. It was a Yorktown-class heavy cruiser built to destroy the Norran raiders who were terrorizing human colonies on the UCs. Lieutenant Keith Campbell woke up when alarms went off and red emergency lights flashed through the crew quarters. He jumped from his bed. Briggs sat at the empty table with her teeth clenched as she spoke to her officers. "Listen up, people," she said. "An enemy raiding party hit the colony on Epsilon Ceti III. They've taken hostages and fortified their position. We're the closest ship, so Stuff Fleet Command has ordered us to respond at maximum warp to free or evacuate the colonists." Keith took a deep breath, feeling both anxious and tense. The Norskins were a vicious race of reptiles that attacked quickly and hard before disappearing into the void. Starfleet had not been able to hold them for long enough to get even with them until now. As the crew rushed to battle stations, Keith's friend Mike elbowed him in the ribs. "Guess the brass wants to see what these New Yorktown-class ships can really do," he asked. "Time to show those Norran bastards what happens when you mess with humanity," Keith said. Diagnostics on the cruiser's scary array of particle beam cannons and aerospace strike craft wings. The Dauntless was meant to be the spearhead of humanity's iron fist against the hostile races that wanted to prey on them. He imagined the colonists, huddled in terror, praying for rescue before the Norran dragged them back to a fate worse than death in the raiders' filthy slave holds. Keith's face showed that he was determined that this wasn't going to happen. The galaxy needed to see what human warships were really capable of, so Keith and Mike rushed the armory while the shipwide battle alert blared in their ears. They quickly took off their uniforms and put on their Wolverine heavy power armor, the heavy plates clicking into place over their muscular bodies. Keith grabbed his T-90 plasma rifle and slung it over his shoulder, while Mike carried an MK6 auto shotgun loaded with depleted uranium slugs as a hostage. It's unlikely that those Narran jerks would go that low, but Keith just nodded. His mind was already racing through possible breaches and clear tactics in the sick. Captain Briggs leaned over the hollow table and looked at the tactical display of the colony and the Nara ships in orbit. Suddenly, the screen flickered, and Commodore Janus's sneering face appeared with his sharp teeth bared in a vicious grin. "Unfortunately for you, I've taken some precautions. My warrior has placed plasma bombs among the hostages. If you or any of your ships come within 1 light minute of the colony, I will detonate them, killing hundreds." Briggs' eyes narrowed, but she kept her voice calm. "What do you want?" Janus, the Norran Commodore's smile grew. "Surrender, Captain. Give me your ship and its valuable advanced weapons. If you do this, I might not kill the colonists." "Do what you're told." Briggs slammed her fist on the empty table and yelled, "Starfleet does not negotiate with terrorists and butchers. Commodore, if you hurt those hostages, there will be nowhere in this galaxy you can hide from us." Janus snapped, his face contorted with anger. "It's you who should hide." Briggs heard a sudden cut in the transmission. She took a deep breath and turned to her officers. As Keith and Mike were finishing getting ready, the tactical net in their heads suddenly flashed an urgent message from the captain. It said that hostages were in danger, plasma bombs were in play, and covert extraction was needed. Keith frowned as he thought about the message, but he knew what he had to do. "Change of plans, buddy," he told Mike. "Looks like we're going to have to do this quiet and careful like let's get the var."